So, the Sennheiser IE200. Let's just not try to sugarcoat it here. This was a really hyped up IEM, and it really was a bit of a disappointment. Not so much in how it sounds, just what it takes to make it sound good. So just to catch people up, Sennheiser IEMs have not really had the best reputation in how they sound. Then the Sennheiser IE600 came out, which was tuned quite well. So, when news of the Sennheiser IE200 came out, and it was basically a cheaper version of the IE600, people got quite excited. Well, it came out, we got it, and it has a lot of issues. The first big issue is just simply the cable. The cable, while the cable works, although some people have said that there is some issues with dropout, but all in all, the cable is a cable, it works, but it's a really cheap feeling cable. And there's nothing wrong with having a cheap cable. I mean, we have plenty of cheap Chi-Fi IEMs, but the issue is, this is an IEM that costs $150, and the cable is quite literally one of the worst cables I've ever had to deal with an IEM. If you remember the Blonde BL03, that was an IEM that people said you always have to replace the cable because it's kind of thin, it tangles easily, and it's just not very nice feeling. This IEM is like that, but thinner. It feels cheap, it's very thin, it's springy and always wants to coil up, and even the way it's made, it just feels very cheap. You know how a lot of IEM cables where the Y-split is, they'll have something to kind of create the joint and make it strong? Well, on this one it's just shrink wrapped. And then you know how a lot of IEM cables will have a slider to tighten up around your chin? This is like a little plastic tube. It pretty much looks like they cut off the end of a straw and put it on the cable. So putting that aside, okay, the cable is just sort of a luxury item, let's call it that. How about what actually makes the IEM sound the way it sounds? Well, there's another big issue. The IE200 was advertised as having two options for the bass. Now the way that this worked is at the nozzle, there's a little port and then also a groove. The idea is, if you take the tip and push it in all the way, so like you would on a normal IEM, you have a full seal and that port is covered. So what will happen is you'll have a higher bass response with the tip pushed in. But then they also advertise the ability to pull the tip out halfway, and then that little port with a groove in it will allow a controlled leak so you can have less bass on the same product. In theory, it's an okay idea, but the problem is in real world use, it's really unreliable. Even with the port pushed all the way in, you get really inconsistent bass response, and then when you have the tip pulled out to allow the bass leak, from there it's really not reliable. Normally when I measure an IEM, it's not too big of a deal. The biggest issue is just lining up the resonance peak to have a consistent measurement at a certain insertion depth. Depending on how the IEM was seated, it had a different bass response every single time I measured it. At the point where sometimes on one side, I would have a 10 dB difference between the bass response when they were both pulled out in the second position. It was really not something that I enjoyed measuring this IEM. That said, when we got a more consistent sort of measurement when in second position, there was still seemed to be about a 5 dB difference depending on exactly how the tip was seated. Even with that, we had another issue. None of the tips really fit me well. All of the silicone tips led to a bass leak. Even ones that should fit my ear, they would never seal right. For some reason, these particular tips seem to want to fold in on themselves. So even when I would get them in my ear, they would always cause a crease somewhere and I would lose all bass response. They also came with foam tips, and they also did come with foam tips though, and with these I could get sort of a bass response, but the problem is the foam tips are a weird size as well. I could get a seal with the medium tips, but they still felt too big for me. But then using the small tips, I was back to having an unreliable bass response. From this, it was just getting really annoying trying to use this IEM. I decided to switch out to using different tips, SpinFit CP100 tips, which are kind of my go-to tips whenever I use aftermarket tips on IEMs. And something interesting happened. The bass response increased, not only higher than having a proper seal with the normal tips, but they had an even higher sub-bass response than before, to the point where it was actually getting close to the IE600 bass response. And this is something that a lot of other people noticed too. Different people and reviewers noticed that when they used different tips that sealed the bass port even better, you'd end up with a much better sub-bass response. From this, different people had different options to fix the issue. I have to give a shout out to Timmy from Giz Audio for mentioning the idea of taping over the bass port. Simply wrapping a piece of tape around the nozzle to seal off the base port pretty much fixes all the issues with the response and the leakage. This is something that I think Sennheiser really should have just done from the beginning. Instead of focusing on having a gimmick of having two different bass responses, they should have just left it as it was with the sealed off port and then given us the IEM how it was. From that, even with the bad cable and the tips that don't really fit, at least there would be more reason to forgive this IEM for its other faults. So let's look a little bit into the measurements and see what I got out of this. Now this is the measurement with the original tips in its optimal sort of setting. When I could get the most consistent bass response measurement from it without it leaking, this is what I ended up getting. We'd get sub bass close to the level of Harman, but then it would have a smooth transition through the mids. Coming up to 3 kilohertz where we'd get a dip and then a peak here. Normally with IEMs measured on a 711 coupler, we'll get a peak here at 8 kilohertz and then a dip and then another peak and then another peak again. Now this is from a resonance of the coupler itself, and where the resonance happens changes depending on the insertion depth. As well as that resonance moves, the peak changes as well as the rest of the treble response. The thing is, usually we'll ignore that 8 kHz peak because it's not quite representative of how it'll react in your ear. Something interesting is this peak is a lot wider, and through other measurements I did of measuring at different insertion depths, it seems more like there is an actual treble shelf here that's not just an artifact of the measurement coupler. That said, a lot of this treble is more in air frequencies, and it's not really something that comes across as harsh or grainy, more so just emphasizing smaller details that often aren't really represented in many other IEMs. Some vocals and mid-range elements do seem a little bit recessed, but when it comes to this particular IEM, in its stock configuration, it ended up sounding a bit too thin and just upper treble heavy in my opinion. Like, it sounded okay, but it wasn't anything that impressed me at all. When we put it in its second position, it wasn't an enjoyable listen to me. But that said, once I put spin fit tips on it and completely covered up the bass port, this IEM changed quite differently. Now we got a more substantial sub bass boost to kind of help balance out the rest of the frequency response. Looking at it more flat, you can see that it does have the sub bass boost and then a lot more treble emphasis, creating sort of a nice U-shaped sound signature. It's not neutral, it's not really anything I can call a reference sound, it's just more of a fun sound now. You have a substantial sub bass boost with a lot of treble air. So with all that, do I recommend the IE200? I can't really say so. After all the modifications and everything, yeah, you can get something that is kind of enjoyable and fun and sounds punchy and detailed, but just for something that costs this much in today's market, but before you even start, you have to change out the tips, you have to put tape over the nozzle, and then replace the cable, which, mind you, for most MMCX cables to even fit, you'll have to modify the shell of the IEM itself, probably voiding your warranty. It just seems not really like something I can recommend at this point. Even with all that, in this day and age, for an IEM to come out and cost this much and not come with a waifu on the box, it's just, I can't recommend it.